Assalamu alaikum students, it's Dr. Kausar Suhail with second lecture on social psychology. This lecture is in fact an extension of the previous lecture, that is about introduction to social psychology. In the previous lecture we discussed a couple of definitions of social psychology. One of them was of Gordon Allport. Allport is a very famous social psychology and has a lot of contribution for this field. His definition maintained that social psychology is the scientific study of individuals' thoughts, behavior, actions, and feelings. And it is also one of the purposes of social psychology that how these thoughts, action, behavior, and feeling of the person are affected by the presence of other people. And by the presence of other people, we mean actual presence, imagined presence, or the implied presence. This definition has been quoted in almost every book of social psychology. So this is considerably important to understand this definition. After discussing that definition, we talked about 3 questions of interest in this discipline. And these 3 questions of interest were evaluating our relationships with people, evaluating ourselves also was one factor of that. Another question of interest was that how we relate to other people. And the third question was how we interact with other people. We finally related these 3 questions of interest to the 3 components of that definition that I described before. And these 3 components are feeling, thought, and behavior of individual. And then afterwards we discussed how the presence of other people, whether it is real presence, whether it is imagined or implied presence, could affect the behavior and thoughts of a person. Afterwards, at the end, we discussed that it is not only the presence of people that could affect the actions of a person, but there are many other factors which could create some difference, which could bring a change in the behavior of a person. For example, there could be transitory situational factors, there could be biological and physiological factors, and apart from that, there could be evolutionary and cultural factors. So overall, we discussed 3 kinds of these factors, and we also said that these could serve as the 3 kinds of explanations for human behavior. One level of explanation was group level explanation. Evolutionary and cultural factor could come into that. And the second level of explanation was individual level explanations. Individual level explanation would include physiology of a person, his all genetic makeup, and then afterwards we also discussed that a person's past experience is also important in contributing to his actions and behavior. And the third was the mediating factor. Mediating factors could be a person's personality traits, temperament, intelligence, and many other factors. For example, extroversion and introversion, that a person is extrovert or introvert in his behavior. So we concluded at the end that these 3 factors could influence our thoughts, actions, behaviors, and feelings. And remember that these 3 factors are not mutually exclusive because they could affect each other. उन सब का एक दूसरे पर असर हो सकता है. For example, evolutionary factors can determine our body makeup, how we are made. And then cultural factors could also influence our current behavior. And cultural factors would also determine how our parents would be treating us, how they will be behaving with us, and then how we will be learning from that experience. And then ये सारा जो our past experience or physiology है, that could make a person's individual characteristics, personality traits and temperament, etc. So on the whole, we discussed that a person's actions, feelings, thoughts, they could be determined by many factors. One of them could be presence of other people, and the other could be situational, evolutionary and cultural factors. In today's lecture, we would talk about many other things. One of them will be that we will be discussing the relationship of social psychology with other disciplines. The second will be that we will discuss the social psychology as a profession, and we will discuss what are different prospects for that person who is specialized in social psychology. And then apart from that, we will discuss some application of social psychology. Like I mentioned in the previous lecture, that it is very important when we study some subject that it should be applied in everyday life setting. And finally, we will discuss the historical roots of social psychology. First of all, we would do some exercise, small activity. I would like you to see a few statements. In fact, these are research findings, and they are about one criticism that often people are doing it for social psychology. For example, people say that social psychology may be just what common sense says, and social psychology rephrase what people already know. And this phenomena could be called as if I already know it all along. So people criticize that social psychology is in fact simply common sense. So it means that the results of the social psychology's investigations are what ordinary people normally know beforehand, but it is not the case. First of all, I would like you to see at the statements, which are in fact the research findings, and I would like you to think in your mind that how many of them actually confirm to what you already know. So let's look at a few slides. First statement is, attending to people's face leads to the greatest success in detecting their lies. The second statement is, people are less likely to blame accident victims if they are similar to them. The third statement is, people who are paid a great deal of money to perform a boring task enjoy it more than those who are paid very little. I'll show you the next slide now. One finding of the research is that men express more hostile attitude toward women than women do toward men. Another statement is, people think that physically attractive people are less intelligent than those who are physically unattractive. Another statement, and in fact research finding, is that playing violent video games or engaging in contact sports allows people to blow off steam, making them less aggressive. It means that when they get out their steam, that makes them less aggressive. The next slide. In fact, this is the final one. Accident victims are more likely to be helped when there are many bystanders nearby. All of them make sense, but surprisingly, all of them have been proven wrong by the research that has been conducted by social psychologists. Actually, events are more obvious and predictable in hindsight than beforehand. When we know the result of some research, then suddenly it becomes very predictable, and it seems that I was already thinking on the same lines. The next section of today's lecture is comparison of social psychology with other disciplines. Social psychologists, as I said before, are interested to study what people think about, feel, and relate to each other. But other disciplines, for example, personality psychology and sociology, are doing the same. So what makes social psychology distinct from other disciplines? We have to see that now. In the previous lecture, I mentioned that social psychology has an overlap with a number of disciplines. If on one hand, it has similarities with sociology, anthropology, and communication, then on the other hand, it has similarities with subdivisions of psychology. For example, personality psychology, cognitive psychology, and biology also. I'll show you one slide in which we will talk about the similarities and differences between psychology and sociology. There is one quotation here on the slide which you can see by Edward Jones. He said in his Handbook of Social Psychology in 1998 that the larger of the two is psychological branch, psychological social psychology and sociological social psychology. It means psychology is the main element of social psychology and sociological social psychology. In this slide, you will see a few differences that have been highlighted: psychological social psychology and sociological social psychology. Number one difference is that the central focus of social psychology is on individual, while sociological social psychology downplays the role of individual. It instead focuses on groups and society. Second difference is that social psychology is interested in variations in behavior which are believed to be due to people's interpretation of social stimuli and differences in personality. It means that social psychology is basically interested in how people interpret social stimuli and how they are showing individual differences in different people's personalities. If you look at the slide, you will see, on the other hand, sociological social psychology looks for the explanation for such societal-based problems as poverty, crime, and deviance. So it means that sociological social psychology is more interested in society-level variables like socioeconomic status, poverty on bigger level, and then societal norms. The third difference is that experimentation is the primary research method in psychological social psychology, while it is followed by correlational studies and then by observation. As compared to that, sociological social psychology basically use observational method and the correlational studies, and then it is followed by experimentation at the end. These were basically three primary differences between sociological social psychology and psychological social psychology. There have been calls to combine these two disciplines due to number of overlapping factors. And from 1946 to 1967, there has been a debate to start a new doctorate program with a combination of these two subjects at the University of Michigan, USA. However, people did not agree to that because of many differences between the two disciplines. Although these two disciplines are regarded quite different also, but nowadays they are accepting each other's theories, each other's principles also. And currently, there is more work going on in psychology on the impact of culture, for example, on the individual. Similarly, sociologists are increasingly becoming interested in individual differences. Regardless of the cross-pollination between these two disciplines, in future, they will continue to contribute to social behavior in diverse but in important way. Now we'll look at the difference between social psychology and personality psychology. I'll show you another slide that will be describing similarities and differences between both disciplines. They both are considered in fact allies because focus of both of these disciplines on individual rather than groups. For this reason, American Psychological Association has included them in the same journals. One of them is Personality and Social Psychological Bulletin, and the other one is Social Psychology and Personality Journal. There are a few differences between these two disciplines also. One of them is that personality psychologists are interested in individual differences, while social psychologists are interested in common humanity, that how people view and affect each other. It means that personality psychologists are basically interested in how people differ from each other. For example, they can, if they will be investigating aggression, then they will be looking at what are the differences between people and why they are different. While social psychology will be looking at that what are the social influences which people make different in aggressive behavior. And similarly, if they are behaving kindly, then what are the social influences that predispose people to behave in a particular way? Another difference between social psychology and personality psychology is in history of both disciplines. Social psychology is a relatively younger field. The real work on social psychology started, in fact, after 1950s, while we can find many personality theorists in the beginning of previous century. For example, Adler, Jung, Karen Horney, Freud, and Rogers. Now let's look at the difference between social psychology and biology. Actually, nature and nurture both together form us. Many studies have shown that hereditary factors are very important how people behave and how they react to different situations. Moreover, it has been shown that a number of psychopathology, for example, different psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, and mania are largely determined by hereditary factors. So it means that nature is very important in contributing to many of our activities, many of our behavior in real life. But social psychologists find it difficult to believe that more complex kind of behavior like helping, conformity, getting angry on something, they are simply the result of some neural or molecular activity of human beings. So they maintained that perhaps it is the interaction of nature and nurture that should be considered more important. So it means that for better understanding of human behavior, we should consider both under the skin and between skin influences. Now let's discuss social psychology as a profession. Social psychology in the previous few years has grown a lot, and it has adopted a very wider perspective. I'll show you a slide which will describe different professions that social psychologists at different levels are adopting. If you look at the slide, that is in fact a pie chart that is showing that PhD level social psychologists are working in colleges and universities, and at the same time they are working in business and government setting also. 75% currently are working in colleges and universities, while 17% are in other government or business sector. Then it also shows that MSc level social psychologists have in fact greater job diversity. 12% work in 4-year degree colleges, 44% are working in other non-university academic settings, 20% are working in business and government sector, while 24% are working in human service fields. And by human service fields, I mean clinics, health agencies, NGOs, etc. And the current trend is that new kinds of employments are offering to social psychologists in different sectors, for example, in health, in environment, in legal system, and in clinics. As far as prospects of working in Pakistan for social psychologists are concerned, I feel sorry to say that social psychologists are working in a very limited fields. Most of them are working in universities where they are performing the task of teaching plus research, and some of them are doing some kind of consultancy for some NGOs. But apart from that, social psychologists are not working in other sectors in which people who are specialized in social psychology, they are working in developed countries, for example, in business sector, in legal system, and in many other fields. Let's look at the application of social psychology. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, that it is very important for a discipline that it should be practically applied to everyday life situation. And social psychology is the kind of field that is very applied in nature. Social psychology, in fact, always had intimate ties with the political and cultural circumstances. In this slide, which I am going to show you now, you will see a number of historical factors which contributed to research in social psychology. You can see here that after World War, a lot of research was conducted on prejudice and conformity. In fact, people wanted to know that what happens when people obey a destructive kind of authority and how they conform to such kind of behavior. And that research was mostly done by Milgram, and then it was followed by many other people. And you can also see that between 1940s and 1950s, there was a civil war in US. And because of that civil war, work started on prejudice and stereotypes. Similarly, between 1960s and 1970s, more research was started on aggression. And the reason was that violence and higher crime rates were observed during that decade. Similarly, between 1980 and 1990, health psychologists observed that people's behavior is very important in making them susceptible to different health problems. And at the same time, it was also realized by national insurance companies that health sector's drug and medicine budget was skyrocketing. So they realized that they need to control it. And that is why they were interested to find out those social reasons which could contribute to health or otherwise. So more research was started on social factors in contributing to health or otherwise. And then every one of us is aware that people are talking more about terrorism, suicide bombing after 9/11. Never in history more research was conducted on terrorism. In fact, some research also started in Pakistan on these issues. After October 8, 2005 earthquake in Pakistan, a lot of research was started on this issue. So you can see that social psychology is very responsive to the cultural and political scenario. And wherever circumstances are going, social psychology is going along. I am aware of a few research projects which are currently going on the topic of earthquake in Pakistan. Some of them are, for example, determinants of psychosocial problems in survivors of earthquake and psychosocial problems faced by earthquake victims in Pakistan. So we can see that a lot of research contributes to the social circumstances. In previous century and the current century, total 116 earthquakes have hit different areas of the world. And the current century has already seen 16 earthquakes in these few years. But in Pakistan, perhaps there were just a few studies that have been conducted on these kind of problems, unless we were faced by this real life mega problem. So the purpose of describing all this is that social psychology research is very much responsive to the circumstances. Now we will shift to the last topic of this lecture, that is historical roots of social psychology. I'll show you one slide which will describe different periods that social psychology's history can be divided in. First period is between 1884 to 1934, the early years of history of social psychology. The second period is the coming of age between 1935 to 1945. The third period was of rapid expansions between 1946 to 1969. And the fourth one is crisis and reassessment period. That was between 1970 to 1984. And then the last one is an expanded global view of social psychology that was from 1985 to present period. So let's see what happened in the early years in the history of social psychology. As I described before, that social psychology is a relatively younger discipline. More of the work started, in fact, after 1950s and after World War II. And we can also see that the history of psychology reveals its American roots. If you look at this slide, you will see that the first experiment in social psychology can be attributed to one person who was called Norman Triplett. In 1897, he published this paper on the first experiment on social psychology. He was working at Indiana University, USA, and he was interested in finding out that how does the performance of a person change when other people are present. In fact, he was very much interested in motorcycle rides, and he observed that motorcycle and bicycle riders, they paced faster when they were pacing with other cyclists. So he wanted to investigate this phenomena, that what happens when people are working together, या इकट्ठे काम कर रहे हैं या अकेले काम कर रहे हैं, और उसने ये कहा कि इससे परफॉर्मेंस में बहुत फर्क पड़ता है. तो उसने एक और एक्सपेरिमेंट किया जिसको हम कहते हैं कि ये सोशल साइकोलॉजी का पहला एक्सपेरिमेंट था. और वो एक्सपेरिमेंट का क्या था कि उसने बच्चों को कहा कि एक काम करना है. ही आस्क्ड देम टू परफॉर्म अ टास्क, और वो अकेले भी करना है और दूसरे बच्चों के साथ भी करना है. सो ही फाउंड आउट दैट इन फैक्ट children were faster when they were working with other children. So he is credited for devising the first social psychological experiment in history. However, he did not do anything to make social psychology as a distinct and a separate discipline from other fields. And this credit goes to two other people. One of them is Edward Ross, who was an American, and the other one is William McDougall, who was English. They both wrote 2 books separately, in fact, and they were called Social Psychology. So these were perhaps the first books on social psychology, so the credit to introduce social psychology as a separate discipline goes to both of them. However, still, social psychology was not distinctly recognized as a separate discipline. Then a third book on social psychology was written, and that was written by Floyd Allport. I'll show you one slide. You can see his picture. This is Floyd Allport. इस डेफिनेशन में हमने देखा कि फ्लॉयड अल्पोर्ट ने बहुत एम्फसिस दिया है इंडिविजुअल पर, और अभी पिछली कुछ स्लाइड्स में हमने देखा कि जो डिफरेंस सोशियोलॉजी और साइकोलॉजी के दरमियान है वो यही है कि साइकोलॉजी एम्फसाइजेस इंडिविजुअल व्हाइल सोशियोलॉजी एम्फसाइजेस सोसाइटी. इसका मतलब ये हुआ कि फ्लॉयड एल्पोर्ट प्लेड अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट रोल इन सोशल साइकोलॉजी मेकिंग अ डिस्टिंक्ट डिसिप्लिन, and the credit goes very much to him. Afterwards, he worked on conformity, non-verbal communication, and social affiliations. अब हम दूसरे पीरियड की तरफ चलते हैं, सोशल साइकोलॉजी की हिस्ट्री का सेकेंड पीरियड. So let's look at this slide. This period is between 1935 to 1945. During this time, 2 events with greatest impact happened. One of them was Great Economic Depression in the USA, and the other was social and political upheaval in Europe. And due to that, there was a lot of unemployment in America due to stock market crash in 1929. Because of this frustration in the society and economic upheaval and economic depression, many people adopted the liberal ideas of Roosevelt, or more radical views of communist or socialist parties. इसी वक्त ये सोचा गया कि जब लोगों के इतने प्रॉब्लम हैं तो सोशल इश्यूज इतने बढ़ चुके हैं तो उनको हल करने का भी कोई तरीका होना चाहिए. So in the slides you can see that in 1936, because of these factors, Society for the Psychological Studies of Social Issues was established, and that was abbreviated as SPSSI. The advantage of establishment of this society was that it infused ethical values into the discussion of human life and into the subject of social psychology. This period can be divided into further two periods. One was anti-intellectual atmosphere in Europe and the other was post-war period. Now let's look at first slide. The rise of fascism in Germany, Spain and Italy created a strong anti-intellectual atmosphere in many of Europe's educational institutions. And because of that, many leading social psychologists like Fritz Heider, Kurt Lewin and Theodore Adorno, they migrated to America. And while they remained in America, they, together with different Americans, they applied knowledge of human behavior in a variety of wartime programs. For example, undermining of enemy morale and selection of officers for the Office of Strategic Services. So we can see that in this time, when people were frustrated by the conditions in Europe, they migrated to America. And there, together, they created a few changes and they used their knowledge of human behavior in a number of practical fields. So here we can also see the practical use of social psychology. A very important social psychologist of that period was Kurt Lewin. He was a Jewish refugee from Germany and as I stated before that he migrated from Europe to America. अभी मैं आपको उसकी तस्वीर दिखाती हूँ. आप इसकी तस्वीर देखिए. He is Kurt Lewin. और अब एक और स्लाइड देखते हैं. इस स्लाइड में you will see a quotation that is by Kurt Lewin. He stated that no research is without action and no action is without research. At that time, actually, there was a debate about whether social psychology should be considered a pure or applied science. Some people were saying basically it is concerned with just conducting research, theoretical research. And the other people were arguing that just conducting theoretical research is not enough and social psychology should be practical enough and should be responsive to the current life problems. So Kurt Lewin said that there is no point in arguing that. And he said that there is no question that we should have this kind of discussion because no research can be without action and no action can be without research. He was also president of SPSSI in 1941. And by his 1947, he had provided many of social psychology's defining characteristics. So we can say that he contributes a lot to the history of social psychology. In the next slide, I'll show you the next period in the history of social psychology, that is post-war period. In the slides, you can see that after World War II, there were new prospects open for the social psychologists. Social psychologists had many platforms available now for them. They could secure government grants and more importantly, they could train graduate students. But the future social psychologists were white, male and middle class. And many of them mentors actually had come from Europe. At that time, when social psychology was flourishing in USA, but war has actually virtually destroyed the discipline overseas. So there was not much work done on the field of social psychology in other countries. And more of the work was conducted by social psychologists who are living in USA. And many of them, as I stated before, they had come from Europe to migrate for the USA. In post-war period, USA had emerged as the unchallenged world power. And along with its material goods exported, USA was also exporting its social psychology. So we can see that during post-war period, there were some new prospects for social psychologists. They were enjoying a better status as social scientists in their community. They were conducting more research. They were able to secure more government grants, and they had started training graduate students. And the advantage of training graduate students is that in the future, there is very much chance that this discipline is going to flourish because there will be more and more professional, adequately trained people in the market. Now, the next period is, which you can see in this slide, between 1946 and 1969. That was a period of rapid expansions. And these rapid expansions were possible due to the immigration of a lot of scholars from Europe to America. They, along with the help of young American social psychologists, started research on a number of social psychology dimensions. In this slide, you can see that research started on a number of issues. For example, research on psychological parameters of authoritarian personalities was conducted by Theodor Adorno and his colleagues in 1954. Adorno, in fact, wanted to know that why a civilized country like Germany and its citizens could fall under the influence of one dictator, that was obviously Hitler at that time. And it was followed by some research on obedience and conformity. And the person who is responsible for conducting most of that research is Milgram. Stanley Milgram, in fact, extended to obedience experiments, and they wanted to examine the conditions that make people more likely to obey destructive authority figures. His landmark experiments are very famous in social psychology, and you will study them also when we will talk about ethics in social psychology. Then more work was started on group influence on individual, and that work was conducted by Ash in 1956. And then another work which was in the similar direction, that was conducted by Hovland and his colleagues in 1949, and that was about the power of persuasive communication. So you can see that more work in this period was conducted actually on conformity, obedience, and then power of persuasive communication. They have one theme common in them, that they show that at that time there was a suppression in society, and people wanted to investigate that what are the factors that people are obeying to authority figures, and why are they being suppressed, and why are they conforming to group pressures. So again, we could see the application of social psychology, and we can see here that how social circumstances could contribute to social research. In the next slide, you can see some more work that was conducted during post-war period. In fact, one of the theories got very popular at that time. That was a cognitive dissonance theory that was presented by Leon Festinger in 1957. Cognitive dissonance maintains that people's thoughts and actions are motivated by a desire to maintain cognitive consistency. And that theory became very popular because of its simplicity, and that is why it became very popular inside the discipline of social psychology and outside the discipline of social psychology also. Then there was a period of Vietnam War in 1950s and 1960s. In the decade of 1960s, when there was a war going on between Vietnam and USA, that period was called a period of turmoil because of political assassinations, social unrest, and urban violence. So a lot of research when started on different issues pertaining to World War problems, and later on the war between different nations, then research also took one twist. More research, as I stated before, was conducted on interpersonal conflicts, conformity, obedience, and now during the war between Vietnam and USA, more research started on conflicts between nations, social unrest, discrimination, and prejudice. So when we see that a lot of research is being conducted in a society on the problems that are being highlighted by the circumstances, then people also realize that this is not going on very well, because at that time, then people thought that there should be some constructive way to change society for the better. And research again took a twist. What is that? We will see that in the next slide. So now more research was devoted on aggression, but at the same time on love, helping and attraction. So you can see that previously more research was conducted on conformity, obedience, destructiveness, conflicts, urban violence, and now there is a shift. Although there is some research that was still going on aggression, but people also realized that they should talk about something else also. And that is why more work was started on some different topics like helping, loving, and attraction. At the same time, one groundbreaking research was conducted on romantic attraction. You can see that in slide. That work was conducted by Hetfield and Burchett in 1969 on interpersonal and romantic attraction. At that time, some people also criticized that why social psychologists should continue and should put their efforts in a research which is about romantic attractions. But despite all these criticisms during the 1960s, the federal government of USA expanded attempts to cure societal ills with the guidance of social scientists. So we can see that there was a shift of research from some negative social interactions to positive social interactions. So let's move to the next period in the history of social psychology. In the slide, you can see that this period is between 1970 to 1984, and that was the crisis and reassessment period. Many people realized that although there was a shift in research focus, but society's problems were still there. They are not being solved. At that time, Theodore Newcomb, he pointed out that people's expectations are greater, which are not being fulfilled, and there is no chance that in the near future they could be fulfilled. At the same time, there was some criticism from women and minorities about the biases of a white, male, dominant view of reality. They said that the literature that has been provided by social psychologists, they are mainly reflecting the attitude of white male. And it is not showing anything which could be of relevance to females or to minorities. And then we can see that out of this crisis, more vital and inclusive field of social psychology emerged, and rigorous ethical standards were adopted. And then social psychology began moving toward more responsible positions, because when it was pointed out that ethically it is not correct that some particular subgroup of population like women should be ignored or some ethnic minorities shall be ignored, so more ethical standards were also devised to conduct research. And then we can see that at that time there were some other progress that happened in the field of social psychology. For example, more research methods were introduced. In the beginning, like I pointed out before, that the popular research method in the field of social psychology was experimentation. But now, apart from experiments, correlational studies were also given importance. And at that time, in 1970s, there was a cognitive revolution. Cognitive psychology as a discipline became very popular, and more psychologists were conducting research on different dimensions and topics of cognitive psychology. And at that time, many ideas were imported from cognitive psychology to social psychology. And research in cognitive psychology brought a lot of difference, in fact, a significant change in the focus of social psychology also. Now we move to another period, and that is the global view of social psychology. And that period is from 1985 to present. If you look at this slide, you could see that different kind of developments happened during this period, which started actually from 1985. In the 1970s, both European and Latin American social psychological associations were formed. And then until now, psychology, in fact, social psychology was more popular in USA only. And more work was conducted in USA, and people who actually had migrated from Europe, they were also conducting research in the same country. However, now people realize that more research should be conducted in other countries also. Overseas social psychology emphasized on different issues. They emphasized more on intergroup and societal variables in explaining social behavior. So in that way, this discipline was reshaped by the help of research from other nations also. Social psychologists around the world started exchanging ideas, and they started collaborating on multinational studies. In these researches which were conducted between different nations, the main topic of interest was whether behavior is cultural specific or it could be due to shared evolutionary heritage. And a lot of research we can see that emerged from this period is about this controversy. Some people were saying that behavior is in fact culture specific. It means that certain kind of behaviors are present more, they are more prevalent in certain societies. While other people were saying that we all share as human beings certain characteristics. But maybe both perspectives are right, and we share certain characteristics as human beings, but at the same time, there are in fact many issues which are culture specific. So at that time, you can see again that USA was still performing as a professional center of gravity, that more of the work was being conducted in USA. But at the same time, some work was being produced from European countries and third world countries. I'll show you one quotation from Shinha and Tam and Al in 2003. They said that European and third world social psychology offers the entire field opportunities to perceive new worlds of reality. And they said this is the new world of reality when people should also look at the research from third world countries, because that can be with a different perspective. As I said before, that their topic of interest was also different. Now let's move to the next slide. What is the current status of social psychology? Contemporary social psychology continues the legacy of Kurt Lewin and SPSSI by applying knowledge to a wide arena of everyday life, such as law, health, education, sports, and business. But at the same time, while social psychology's research is expanded to a lot of fields, like I stated before, education, sports, medicine, clinics, health, at the same time, some people are criticizing that we are emphasizing on negative social interaction and negative social behavior too much. But other people point out that if we do not pay attention to negative interactions and negative social behavior, how we are going to modify that? And they said that perhaps it's more important that people should realize where are the problems and what are the problems, because this is the best way to fix the problems. Anyway, the current status of social psychology is that now the research is being conducted on productive as well as destructive social behavior. Now let's look at what research is being conducted currently in Pakistan. Nowadays, some people are conducting research on positive psychology. Positive psychology investigates that how positive traits can be inculcated in people which could promote their mental well-being. और अर्थक्वेक के बाद कुछ स्टडीज अर्थक्वेक के असरात लोगों पर जानने के लिए भी कंडक्ट की गई थी. इससे पहले कुछ सालों से रिसर्च पाकिस्तान में जो हो रही है वो मुख्तलिफ इश्यूज पर है. फॉर एग्जांपल सुइसाइड बॉम्बिंग, टेररिज्म, सुइसाइड इन जनरल, कॉजेज ऑफ सुइसाइड एंड कॉजेज ऑफ वायलेंस. तो हम ये देखते हैं कि रिसर्च जो है वो वक्त के तकाजे के मुताबिक कंडक्ट की जाती है. जो भी हालात होंगे उसके मुताबिक रिसर्च जो है वो अपना रुख चेंज कर लेगी. In today's lecture, we looked at the relationship between social psychology and many other overlapping fields. And apart from that, we also looked at social psychology as a profession. और उसके बाद हमने historical periods में बहुत सारे historical periods का social psychology के हवाले से जायजा लिया. और हमने ये देखा कि different historical periods में research was corresponding well to the circumstances, to the current circumstances at that time, और इसी के मुताबिक जो है वो रिसर्च चलती जाती है. अगले लेक्चर में हम लोग रिसर्च मेथड्स इन सोशल साइकोलॉजी का मुताला करेंगे. Until then, Allah Hafiz.